Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Carlos Martinez. Carlos is a writer and a musician. He is the author of The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. He is also the co-editor of Friends with Socialist China. Carlos, welcome to India and Global Left.
Hey, Jyotish, great to be with you.
I just read your small article, No Great Wall on the Continuities of the Chinese Revolution. I mean, it'd be a good entry point for people who is not familiar with the history of the last 100 years in China. I can also see that you have written it for probably a particular audience with a particular audience in mind and not necessarily going into the witch of every historical events that you have touched upon. But what I could see was you were trying to argue that these different phases of China are not necessarily separate. They are definitely different phases, but they are connected in one way or another. And so I guess we've been discussing a lot on this platform about the Chinese success, most fundamentally the economic miracles that China has seen in the last 40, 50 years. And I guess sometimes we get carried away by in our discussion of science and technology or broad economic indicators and fail to answer why all of that is ultimately linked to socialism. And given you have written so much on China, but also you have argued that all this is tied to socialism, if you could tell us what are the striking achievements of China for you, and how do they relate to socialism? That would be a good starting point.
Sure. I mean, in terms of China's economic success, I think it's useful to try and understand the dimensions of that and to have a realistic assessment of it. China's nominal GDP is $19 trillion, which is second only to the US. The US is still a fair way ahead at around 30 trillion. Um, if you measure it in terms of purchasing power parity, China's in pole position at 40 trillion, US at 30, India at 17. And then you have Russia, Japan, Germany, quite a long way behind that at 6 or 7. So, so China's a huge economy, right? But China's also a huge country with a population of 1.4 billion people. So its per capita GDP is 13 or 14,000 USD. It's very much middle income and a developing country on a pretty similar level to Russia, Turkey, Argentina, or Malaysia. But also it's starting from a very low base, so I don't want to do down China's achievements. In 1949, at the point of the founding of the People's Republic of China, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. And its nominal GDP is now 19 trillion, as I said. Just 25 years ago, at the start of this century, it was 1 trillion. So its GDP has multiplied by a factor of 19 in that time, in 25 years. At that time, in 2000, the size of the US economy was 10 times that of China. Now it's only 1.5 times that of China. So you can see that China's catching up and is on a very powerful upward trajectory. Aside from GDP, and I think GDP is a quite limited measure in terms of economic success. More important is to look at average life expectancy. The Chinese authorities just announced that their average life expectancy has surpassed 79. So getting up towards 80, which would put it in a pretty exclusive club, basically, of very advanced capitalist countries. 79 is on a par with other developed countries. It's comparable with high income countries. It's higher than the US. And the US has been static in the high 70s for the last 20 years. Um, so that's an amazing achievement. The social indicators are all improving. Increasingly, China's got a world-class education system. Increasingly, China's got a world-class health system. In terms of its HDI, its Human Development Index, which is a sort of composite measure which incorporates average life expectancy, per capita GDP, and education levels. China's the only country since they started measuring it that's moved from low level to high level. So they kind of leapfrogged the medium level. Um, People know more or less what China's achieved in terms of poverty alleviation. According to World Bank figures, they lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. They've eradicated extreme poverty a few years ago. And it's useful to remind ourselves of what that actually means, because there's a kind of international definition of extreme poverty, which is being underneath the $2 a day line. Now, China's definition includes that, but according to the Chinese definition, to be out of extreme poverty, not only do you need to meet that income threshold, but you also need to have a guaranteed, decent, nutritious diet, so food on the table, guaranteed dignified housing, so a roof over your head, guaranteed adequate clothing, water, clean water piped into your home, modern energy in your home, and access to universal education, access to universal healthcare. So your children go to school, and if you get sick, you see a doctor. So for China to have achieved 1.4 billion people having all of those guarantees met, your channel is India and Global Left. You're from an Indian background. My father's my father was Indian as well. I've been to India many times. I've got lots of family in India. Um, if you're a villager in India and you have those guarantees met, that you've got food on your table and you've got a roof over your head and your children go to school and you can see a doctor and you're not in debt, you're not in debt bondage, then but by any normal assessment, you're more or less middle class. So this is a really remarkable achievement. And as a developing country, China is clearly doing extremely well and has made unprecedented advances. But it is important to recognize that it is still a developing country. And that's a question that confuses people a little bit. That, well, you look at Shanghai, you look at Beijing, you look at Chongqing, Chengdu, Guangzhou, etc. And these are incredibly modern cities and people live very well and all the rest of it. And China is increasingly an innovator in terms of science and technology. How can it be a developing country? Well, it's still, relatively speaking, a poor country. If the US average per capita income is something like 60,000 and China's something like
Maybe much
13
more
or 14.
now. Maybe
Sorry.
last time I checked was 79,000.
Right, right. Which is very high. Obviously, that's kind of counterbalanced by ridiculous inequality. But China's is only 13 or 14,000. And in the a global system of unequal exchange, China still very much participates in that system as a subject country, right? Yes, China does export some capital, but it doesn't export capital with the intention of extracting surplus value from Western working classes. It's the victim of that relationship. Tens of millions of Chinese workers are employed by Western companies or companies connected to Western-led global value chains, and they're paid very, very low wages. They're very much proletarians in a globalized capitalist system. China's productivity level, its profitability level is still substantially lower than that of the imperialist countries, and therefore China is still a developing country. So that's an important kind of caveat. But yes, China has achieved amazing and unprecedented successes. How has it achieved those successes? Well, you alluded to it in your question and in the introduction. The important factor is socialism, and that includes, as you say, both the major phases of China's development. That is the period of essentially planned economy from the early 1950s to the late 1970s. So the first 3 decades, we can say, of the People's Republic of China, and then the period of reform and opening up from 1978 onwards. The first 3 decades, what's often called the Mao period, tends to be somewhat kind of denigrated and maligned, and it's considered, China is considered as a sort of basket case economy in that period. And, we shouldn't really let that slander stand, because China's progress, historic and unprecedented progress, starts in 1949, not in 1978. Feudalism was dismantled, which is a historic achievement. Land was reformed. Land was given to the people who tilled the land, the peasantry, right? Uh, uh, an end was brought to the most brutal oppression of women, which had reigned in China for centuries and centuries. There was a mass literacy campaign. Healthcare was rolled out to the countryside for the first time. Education was rolled out to the countryside for the first time. And the countryside is where 90% of the population lived. Um, an industrial base was built up. Life expectancy more or less doubled. I think life expectancy was around 35, average life expectancy at the time of the founding of the PRC. By the time Mao died, it was around 67, right? So for every year that Mao was, top leader of the PRC, average life expectancy increased by just over a year. Um, the population size doubled. Population had been static sort of between 400, 500 million for 100 years prior to 1949. In the ensuing 30 years, population size doubled. And famine became a thing of the past. Famine had plagued China for centuries and centuries. After 1960, 1961, there was no more famine in China, which is a very important and serious problem to solve, right? So, a lot of these things are maybe not reflected in GDP figures, but they clearly represent a transformation and a huge improvement in the economy, certainly as far as ordinary people are concerned. Then, excuse me, sorry. Um, from the late 1970s, you've got reform and opening up, which is obviously, a major innovation that responds to changes in the global economy, to, the introduction of automation, containerization, digitization, the birth of global value chains, and also, like regionally speaking, rapid development in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan province, in Hong Kong, in Singapore. And reform also responded to some of the emerging problems in the domestic economy, a level of inefficiency, a level of stagnation, a lack of innovation, a lack of incentives, a level of sort of technological backwardness. So some private capital was introduced, some profit motive was introduced, some market mechanisms were introduced, some foreign investment, some sort of limited price liberalization, and a focus on learning from the West and developing new technologies and all the rest of it. But the point is that it was still socialism. It was still the working class and its allies in charge. The commanding heights of the economy remained under state control. So energy, transport, telecoms, heavy industry, and so on continued to be run by the state. The states continued to own the banks. And the state continued to maintain overall control via regulation, via oversight, even of the private parts of the economy and the collective parts of the economy. Um, the Chinese leadership were very insistent on sticking to what Deng Xiaoping called the four cardinal principles. So maintaining the leadership role of the Communist Party, maintaining working class and peasant rule, maintaining adherence to the socialist path, maintaining adherence to Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Um, so the whole thing was very different to the Soviet reform trajectory, Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, which essentially introduced market elements in a very haphazard and unplanned way, whilst essentially passing political power to a nascent, burgeoning capitalist class. And the results, speak for themselves. The People's Republic of China still exists, which the Soviet Union very sadly doesn't. Yes, there's inequality. Yes, there are billionaires in China. Yes, there are global brands in China. Yes, you can go to Shanghai and get a Starbucks coffee if that's what you really want to do. But practically everybody lives substantially better than they did 40 years ago. Malnutrition is essentially a thing of the past. Homelessness is essentially a thing of the past. Science has gone, like China's gone from being pretty backward in terms of science and technology to being really a science and technology superpower and more or less a world leader on renewable energy, on AI, on space exploration, on telecoms, on advanced industry, and all of these things. Getting to the point where it's catching up with the West in terms of science and technology. So, what I contend is that China's progress and China's continuing trajectory towards modernization of common prosperity is based precisely on socialism. In terms of what the rest of the global South can learn from that, you know, um, there's no template, there's no magic wand, and every country has to find its own path. But I think what China does show us is that it's possible to combine economic development with poverty alleviation, with social progress, with environmental protection, and with a peaceful foreign policy. It shows us that it's possible to break out of underdevelopment. Samir Amin described China as the only truly emerging country in the sense that it's the only country that's going from underdevelopment to development whilst, through its own framework, following its own path without the sponsorship of the imperialist countries, without the sponsorship of the US-led imperialist world system, maintaining its sovereignty. It's allowed in foreign capital, it participates in global value chains, but that's done on its own terms, and that's done in order to get access to the global economy and to get access to modern technology. China could have followed the prescriptions of the IMF. China could have followed the prescriptions of the World Bank. It could have simply slotted itself into the US-led imperialist system, and that's very much what US strategists were hoping for and expecting. But China's developed its own path of modernization, its own path of sovereign development, which is based on common prosperity, which is based on asserting its sovereignty, on developing an ecological civilization. It's very much not based on domination, on colonialism, on imperialism, on war. And one only need to look at China's peaceful record over the past, over the course of basically its existence of 76 years to see the difference of China's modernization process compared to that of North America or Western Europe. Um, so China is showing the global South what's possible, and furthermore, China's rise is creating conditions that actually make it easier for other countries to assert their sovereignty and to find an independent development path. They can trade with China and they can have an investment and trade relationship that's based on equality and mutual benefit without conditionality. China's got a genuine interest in other countries developing, whereas Western development model has relied on the underdevelopment of the global South. That's not the case for China. It benefits China in every way, politically and economically, if the rest of the global South develops along with it.
I've been thinking about what's the future of socialism? What is socialism for the rest of the world, apart from China, Vietnam, and Cuba, et cetera, the existing socialist states and countries. And in that, maybe if you could link that up with you've of course given us a few templates to think about Chinese socialism, why they are socialist. But if you could tell us a little bit more about what are these elements of socialism per se, apart from the broad economic success in the reform period? I mean, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is that the political class is the Communist Party, and so they control power, they control decision making, and that's a huge thing, particularly at the moment of global vulnerabilities, all kinds of shocks, etc., etc. But then one can also think about the financial sector being under the control of the state. Chinese banks, even the central bank becoming very vigilant about maintaining stable exchange rate, which is very critical for their export, which has enormous implications on all kinds of things like interest rates, and that decides a lot of distribution of resources among household corporations and the states. I mean, we can go down that road, but at the end of the day, I come back to the question again and again, that what are these essential features within the Chinese political economy that makes it socialist? One of the arguments of Yuan Yuanang, for instance, is that whole elimination of absolute poverty, or let's say the 800 million figure, the characteristic feature of it is it has not come out of IMF, World Bank like poverty alleviation program. It has mostly come out of what she would say the neoclassical method of rapidly industrializing, and eventually in the process real wages goes up. And it's only recently in the last decade or so they have constituted this poverty alleviation program in terms of eradicating the absolute poverty from the countryside. With all this fog of things, I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on why do you think it's not just a mixed system? I mean, of course, it's a mixed system having a private sector and a public sector, but as socialists, as Marxists, we claim that it's more than a mixed system, it's a socialist system. So what is more than a mixed system there? And from there, if you could connect with what are your thoughts about the rest of the global south, and what elements of Chinese communism or even Soviet communism would be essential in going forward for a 21st century socialism for the rest of the world?
Sure. Um, so yeah, as you've alluded to, we've got to define socialism, right? I'm a traditionalist and a Marxist-Leninist, and on that basis, yeah, I think of socialism as a transitional phase between capitalism and communism. It's a staging post on the road to a classless communist society, which is a society that doesn't feature the exploitation of one human being by another. Um, and the most important component of socialism, of this transitional stage, which it turns out is likely to last, generations and possibly centuries, is this question of working class power, what Marx and Lenin referred to as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Um, so, it's socialism is primarily a political issue, an issue of power. With the working class and its allies in power, then there's lots of scope for variation in terms of how the economy is organized. The economy would just be organized in a way that serves the short-term and the long-term interests of the people, given the conditions in the country and given the prevailing global conditions. So, and on that basis, I consider that the surviving socialist states, the states that we can define as being socialist, are those that continue to be led by communist parties, that continue to feature working class rule. That is China, Cuba, Vietnam, the Lao PDR, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And then, of course, you have a number of sort of socialist-oriented countries that are in the process of exploring a road to socialism, probably Venezuela and Nicaragua being the most obvious examples. As to what makes China, different to socialism, different to capitalism, or not just another capitalist country. Um, I've quoted a few times Eric Lee, who's a Shanghai political analyst. He's interviewed in John Pilger's documentary, The Coming War on China, and they're in Shanghai, and John Pilger's been looking around, and he's got this footage of Starbucks and Gucci shops and all the rest of it. And then he contrasts that with footage of social housing estates and some slightly dilapidated roads and all the rest of it. And he said, well, I'm in Shanghai, and you can see that there's extremely wealthy people here, and there's inequality, and there's obviously private businesses and connection to global value chains. So what makes this different to a capitalist country? And Eric Lee just puts it very simply. He says, look, yeah, we've got billionaires in China. We're a thriving market economy. Um, but the difference between our billionaires and the billionaires in the United States is, in the United States, the billionaires tell the government what to do, whereas in China, the government tells the billionaires what to do. So essentially, China tolerates wealth. China tolerates private capital. China tolerates large companies, big business, billionaires, to the degree that they contribute to the overall development goals of the country. So yeah, the point comes back to what we were saying, that the key thing is working class power. Um, and in terms of what China's achieved on poverty alleviation, on renewable energy, China's clearly the world's only renewable energy superpower. I think last year China was responsible for 60% of all solar energy production and all wind energy production. China's investment and innovation has resulted in global prices of solar materials and solar energy reducing by 70 or 80%, to the point now where if you're nearly anywhere in the world and you're choosing to build a new power station, it's most economically successful, viable, and efficient to build solar or wind, and that's almost exclusively down to China's contribution. So why is it China rather than any other country? that's made that contribution and achieved what it's achieved? Why is it China rather than any other country that's eliminated extreme poverty or solved questions like homelessness? And that must be related to the class nature of Chinese society. I live in Britain, which is a wealthy country, um, but I don't have to walk more than probably 30 meters from my apartment to see people living on the street and to see really desperate poverty, the likes of which you can't see in Beijing and you can't see in Shanghai and you can't see in Chongqing. Um, so why has China achieved what it's achieved and Britain hasn't, and the US hasn't, and India hasn't, and Thailand hasn't? Um, it's because China's government is in a position where it can take decisions on behalf of the working class, on behalf of the peasantry, to divert enormous resources into that project, enormous resources into attending to the short-term and long-term needs of ordinary people. Um, Short-term needs is getting people above the poverty line. Long-term needs is protecting the environment and protecting climate breakdown. You know, China can invest massively in renewable energy and can put solar power at the core of its energy systems because there's no fossil fuel lobby in China, which is able to essentially buy off the government in the same way that there is in Britain, in the same way that there is in the United States. China can say China can build high-speed rail in going into Qinghai, into Tibet, into Xinjiang, into Inner Mongolia, into Yunnan, and the far west and the center of the country, in spite of the fact that it's not going to be profitable. You're probably not going to reap dividends from that for 50 years. You're taking high-speed rail and modern infrastructure to relatively, sparsely populated areas of the country where no private company would make that decision because it's not going to be profitable, or at least it's not going to be profitable for literally decades. But the Chinese state can decide that that's part of their development needs, and in order to economically upgrade the entire country, and particularly the poorer elements of the country, it's necessary to have national advanced infrastructure. So they've got the political and economic power to make that happen. So ultimately, that that shows you that the China is fundamentally different to any capitalist country. Um, in terms of um, in terms of how that can be, those lessons can be applied, and how other countries can learn from China, can learn from the Soviet Union, um, and build their own model of socialism or their own path to socialism. You know, Socialism is not a one size fits all thing, and ultimately every country has to find its own path. And Marxism Leninism isn't a dogma, and it's not a static body of knowledge. It's continually evolving, and I think China's been particularly successful in applying Marxism to its own specific national circumstances, and to its own national traditions and ways of thinking. And Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the three represents, Hu Jintao's scientific outlook on development, Xi Jinping thought, these all represent important contributions to Marxism-Leninism. So there's lots to be learned from China, but probably the most important thing in the long run is the importance of integrating Marxism with the specific conditions prevailing in that country, with the traditions, the conditions, and adapting to an ever-evolving, ever-changing global situation.
A lot of countries have been facing now the brunt of the West. And as the United States has become more and more lunatic, or as imperialism has become more and more naked, uh, bourgeoisie in countries which hitherto had deluded themselves as friends of the West have slowly and gradually coming to terms that they are not considered allies by the imperium. And under such circumstance, obviously, China is facing the brunt of a wholesale war led by the United States, but a lot of other countries are also facing its brunt. And an essential element of socialism in Vietnam, in DPRK, everywhere in China, in former Soviet Union, is national sovereignty and fight against imperialism. Um, there is this rise of BRICS now, and for the first time, I would say, in many years since the decline of the NAM, we have seen a kind of global South politics entering BRICS, which had initially come up more as my own reading is a governmentalist, technocratic kind of body, but with sort of tariffs and all kinds of sanctions being rolled out to every other parts of the world. Now there is a return of the politics, if you like, of the global South to BRICS. Um, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how does the rise of BRICS as a platform benefit the global South as a whole, and to what extent is it a resistance to dying Western imperialism?
Sure. I mean, I think BRICS could reasonably be defined as like the central organizational form of an emerging multipolar world order. And let's talk about what is multipolarity, because I think that's a question around which there's a lot of confusion and obfuscation. To my mind, it's a system of international relations that involves multiple centers of power. So it's an end to the domination of, by one country or by one group of countries. It's a system in which all countries have a say in global governance. All countries shape the rules of the international system to some degree. And it's not simply about, adjustments and relations between the major powers. It includes the rise of the global south. It includes the increasing influence of China, of India, of Brazil, of regional organizations such as the African Union, ASEAN, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and international organizations such as the G77 and the non-aligned movement. And but the most important characteristic is it's a shift away from a situation where any one country or any one group of countries can impose its will on the rest of the world. And I think that answers the critique that can be found on, in parts of the left, that multipolarity is just a sort of reassertion of inter-imperialist rivalry. People say, well, the world situation 100 years ago or in 1914 was also multipolar in the sense that you had, a group of countries that had power and that were competing with one another. So the US was a power, and Britain was a power, and France and Germany and Japan and Russia were powers. What I would contend is that was essentially a unipolar situation. You had one imperialist pole with contradictions and with rivalries within it. So modern multipolarity means that China and India and Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, the Pacific, all have, a seat at the table. Um, and that situation inherently undermines the US-led imperialist world system and is a challenge to Western imperialism. And that's why, the West hates it so much. If you look at the world situation today, so much of the West global strategy is about trying to undermine and sabotage this multipolar trajectory. If you look at the rationale behind the war in Ukraine, this proxy war against Russia, or the attack on Iran, or the regime change operation, 13-year regime change operation in Syria, or the destabilization campaign in Venezuela and in Nicaragua, or the slander about China's foreign policy, this idea that the Belt and Road Initiative is a debt trap and all the rest of it. Even Palestine is linked to this, because Israel is sort of the bulwark of imperialist power projection in West Asia, and everyone knows that an independent Palestine would be aligned with the global South, would be aligned with the multipolar process, would stand in solidarity with the countries that have always stood in solidarity with it. So much of what's going on, so much of the chaos that we see around us today in the world is related to the West's attempts to slow down and roll back the multipolar process. So multipolarity is an assertion of sovereignty. It's a rejection of domination. It's a commitment to cooperation. It's a commitment to shared development. All things that the West opposes. You know, modern imperialism relies on unequal exchange, on underdevelopment, and on the enabling of exploitation. And the imperialist countries, in order to achieve those things, they have to enjoy a monopoly of modern technology, of military power, of control over the global financial system, of intellectual property rights and all the rest of it. That's what they use to enforce their extraction of surplus value from the rest of the world. So when countries assert their sovereignty, when they refuse to be dominated, when they work together to develop themselves and each other, that undermines the whole basis of the system. Um, BRICS, as I say, is really the core instrument and the core organization of this emerging multipolarity. It's not the common term. It's not, an explicitly socialist project. And indeed, it contains like important contradictions within it. China's the only socialist country within BRICS. And BRICS includes countries that a lot of the time go along, more or less play Washington's games, right? India and the United Arab Emirates being probably the most prominent examples. Um, Nonetheless, I think, BRICS and the whole multipolar project do sort of recognize that there's a commonality of interests among all non-imperialist countries in the same way that the non-aligned movement did, in the same way that the Bandung Conference in 1955 recognized a commonality among the countries of the global south, among developing countries, among non-imperialist countries. Even the Indian ruling class has its own interests separate from those of the United States, um, even where it's willing to play silly games devised in Washington, D.C., even where it's willing to participate in the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and allow itself to be used and abused in the US's new Cold War against China and so on. There are comprador elements in the Indian bourgeoisie, but there's also a national bourgeoisie which has its own independent interests that will ultimately benefit from an assertion of sovereignty and from cooperation with China and cooperation with the rest of the BRICS and the rest of the global south. And, on that note, it's significant that Narendra Modi went to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conference in Tianjin a couple of weeks ago, which was his first visit to China since 2018, and that there are some promising signs of rapprochement between the two countries. Um, the other thing about BRICS and the other thing about multipolarity is that I think you can say that, well, multipolarity is not global socialism, but it does open a path for socialism. I would see it as the assertion of sovereignty that's implied by multipolarity as being a necessary but not sufficient condition for building socialism. Once a country has its sovereignty, once it has the right to develop its own path to modernization and development without pressure, without interference, without the threat of war and regime change and destabilization from the imperialist world, then that opens up numerous possibilities for advancing to socialism.
You've mentioned about your life in Britain and having to walk 30 meters to see people lying on the streets. And you are right, we don't see that in Shanghai or Beijing or any other city for that matter in China. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the Western capitalist core, neoliberal capitalism, Western politics, etc., etc. We've seen enormous stagnancy in Europe. We're seeing some kind of growth in the United States, which has fallen below under 2%, but also significant part of that being driven by the AI generated, which some people are even calling as a big bubble. Maybe 33% of the overall growth is contributed by this tiny segment of tech finance in the United States. Add to that massive amount of inequality, massive amount of debt levels. I mean, you spoke about this facade of debt trap. The only thing that comes to my mind on debt trap is the whole capitalist system, whether it's the rural parts of the global south, or whether it's huge amount of household indebtedness in the imperium core, particularly in places like the United Kingdom and the United States. Talk about what are your thoughts about neoliberal capitalism in the West, and how do you define the kind of politics as response to this moribund capitalism in the global North's imperium we are seeing? It's been very toxic, and this is something I don't know what your thoughts are. I have been noticing that in places like Vietnam, in places like China, we don't see this kind of toxic politics that we see in India, definitely in every part of the global north, people pitting against each other in a form of soft civil war, abusing each other. We don't see that in Vietnam or in China. Talk about this rottenness of politics and how that is linked to the decline of capitalism, if you like.
Sure. I mean, I definitely agree that Western imperialism and neoliberalism are in a state of chaos and crisis and decline, and to some extent have been for the last half century, but particularly since, the financial crash of 2008, real wages in North America and Western Europe haven't meaningfully increased since the 1970s. There's massive and widening inequality. There's the steady dismantling of social welfare systems. And I would say that, people my generation expect that our children, the next generation, will have a lower quality of life, um, which is um, which affects the overall kind of social mood, and is not the way we've expected, not the direction we've expected things to go for the past several decades. Increasing numbers of people are living in, pretty desperate poverty. Um, and then there are all the social problems that come with that in terms of crime, instability, homelessness, addiction issues, breakdown of communities. Um, and then, the media and politicians misdirect people on the basis of all of that with racism and xenophobia. Hence, you see phenomena like we had last weekend in London with an enormous far-right demonstration in Trafalgar Square, which was overflowing. I mean, there's probably 150,000 people there. It was by far the biggest far-right demonstration that's ever taken place in Britain. And you have other manifestations, such as the success of politicians like Donald Trump or Nigel Farage. In Britain now, Reform UK, which is a far-right party led by Nigel Farage, is leading the polls by quite some distance, essentially on a platform of opposing immigration and threatening, deportation, so-called repatriation of migrants. Racism is getting worse. Sexism is getting worse, and that's reversing a trend of, several decades where these problems were getting gradually addressed, where the situation was gradually improving as a result of people's struggles. But ultimately, it comes down to economics. It comes down to the contradictions of capitalism. It comes down to crises of overproduction. It comes down to a declining rate of profit. The um, and this is basics of Marxist economics, right? You go back to Capital Volume 3, and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as a result of increasing composition of labor, of capital. That's um, a constant of capitalism, right? As time goes on and there's increasing technological basis of production, every unit of output represents less and less human labor, but labor is created by value is created by labor. Um, so that's a constant of capital. Another constant capital is that it's always looking for ways to reverse that trend of declining rates of profit, right? So, which it does through expansion into new markets, through technological innovation, through bringing more and more of the world into the capitalist system, creating new needs and new desires, intensifying exploitation of labor, through financialization, shifting economic activity into the financial sector, with speculation, with securitization, with insurance, with complex debt instruments and CDOs, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a zero-sum game. Like that doesn't create any new value. That just creates winners and losers. It's basically kind of professionalized and legitimized gambling that creates these enormous bubbles, essentially like a giant pyramid scheme that just ends up adding even greater instability to the system. And as for intensifying exploitation of labor and expanding into new markets, those options are becoming more and more limited, precisely due to the rise of the global south, and most importantly, the emergence of China and this, multipolar trajectory that we were just talking about. So the result of all of that is that the Western capitalist classes are in pretty serious trouble. I think I would hesitate to say that capitalism is in a sort of terminal decline, and that this is the final crisis of capitalism. Because if we're honest, we have to admit that capitalism has shown a certain resilience over the centuries, a certain ability to adapt and to reinvent itself. And a century ago, 110 years ago, with the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, people like you and me, our movement also thought that this was the general crisis of capitalism that would inevitably lead to global socialist revolution. It turns out, history doesn't move in a straight line, and historical materialism represents a trajectory, right? It's a process of, progress through slavery to feudalism, to capitalism, to socialism, to communism, but that clearly incorporates twists and turns. It incorporates advances and setbacks. Um, and meanwhile, it's certainly true that the West is losing its economic hegemony. Um, and the G7 countries, which used to represent, 60% of global GDP, now represent more like 25% of global GDP. But the West maintains its military hegemony. The West maintains a global infrastructure of power projection via NATO, via AUKUS and affiliated organizations. The US maintains over 800 foreign military bases around the world. It's got tens of thousands of troops, tens of thousands of weapon systems deployed around the world, including nuclear weapons. The US has got the largest and the most advanced nuclear weapons arsenal. It's got systems of military intelligence for carrying out destabilization campaigns and regime change campaigns. It's able to leverage the dollar Wall Street system and its domination of the global financial system. It's able to leverage means of economic coercion, unilateral sanctions, and all of this is being leveraged to protect the US and its allies' economic interests and to prevent the emergence of a more democratic, a more equal, a more peaceful system of international relations. So, on that basis, it's pretty possible that we're not actually going to get any respite from the system for quite a while. In fact, I'd say we're entering a very dangerous and a very unpredictable phase that's characterized by an ever-present threat of a third world war being waged by nuclear powers, um, an ever-present threat of climate breakdown, and the possibility of passing through various environmental tipping points, the ever-present threat of pandemics, of antimicrobial resistance. What do we do if in 20 years' time we don't have a cure for TB anymore? Um, and we can probably only solve these sorts of issues on the basis of very extensive global cooperation, the likes of which the world has never seen. But what the imperialist powers are giving us is conflict, division, cold wars on hot wars. So navigating through this situation, to safer shores is going to take a great deal of wisdom, patience, creativity, flexibility, and determination. I think it's probably not too controversial to say that China is like de facto in the leadership of that process and of navigating what Xi Jinping often refers to as changes unseen in a century, and putting forward this vision of, a global community of shared future, which is based on the United Nations Charter, which is based on international law, It's China that's taken the lead on renewable energy. It's China that's taken the lead on modernization and industrialization. China's creating all of these kind of global um, common goods, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, and recently launched a couple of weeks ago, Global Governance Initiative. China obviously lies at the core of BRICS, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, very active at the UN level in the G20 and the G77, non-aligned movement. It's got these um, various forums set up for engaging with other organizations of the Global South, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the China CELAC Forum. Um, and you can see that emerging unity on display in Beijing um, a couple of weeks ago on the 3rd of September for the 80th anniversary of China's victory in the war of resistance against Japanese occupation and the end of the global anti-fascist war. Um, you had the heads of state of all the socialist countries, all five socialist countries, so China, Cuba, DPRK, Vietnam, and Laos, all gathered together in the same place. It's the first time, literally in decades, that that's happened, possibly since before the outbreak of the Sino-Soviet split. Might have been the World Conference of Parties in 1957. I haven't checked, but that may well have been the last time that the heads of state of all socialist countries were in one place at one time. Plus, you had Russia there, Iran there, Belarus, Zimbabwe, the Central Asian countries, and several other countries. So there is this sense of China working to unite the global majority and to find a path um, out of imperialism and towards a multipolar and a fair and more equal and democratic world that doesn't involve war and that doesn't involve climate catastrophe. But, it's clear that this is not going to be an easy, quick, or straightforward process.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that you would warn against seeing the decline of the West as some kind of terminal decline, and we are on the verge of a revolutionary change because I do believe that this decline is going to be a long decline unless there are events that would take place which we can't predict. Because as you said, the military hegemony, the military power of the West, it has still retained. I mean, sure, China can display spectacular set of weaponry, and China would definitely give a bloody nose to the United States on its backyard. But if we look at the global basis, so if we look at the global South at large, we are still seeing how the West is beating up countries which they don't like. I would also add to the military power are the global corporations. And here I would say that some kind of uh, Chinese development is very essential because China has an alternative to Amazon, Meta, Google, you name it, but not the rest of the world. Even countries which are not friends of the United States don't necessarily have an alternative to the US-led US corporations. I even disagree with my friends like Ben Norton on the decline of dollar, and we are soon going to debate publicly. But I would add one more point on what you said about this contradictions of rate of profit. I would add AI to that. I think one of the contradictions in the capitalist imperium has been that you have to now rely on AI to keep up the profits. So a lot of the profits that is coming up in the high tech is either because of laying off of workers by replacing them with AI work, or through this huge mania that the future is represented by AI, and so just pour in more and more money, even if this is a bubble. And what that means is that that kind of uh, uh, contradiction to keep profit high at a point where there are profit squeezing in the rest of the areas is also leading to an escalated class war, because on one hand you have to rely on them, but relying on them would mean tremendous laying off of workers, effectively inflating the underemployment and that's a problem not just of the global north. I would say a country like India, for instance, if it has to retain some kind of sovereignty, you would have to invest in technologies like AI. On the other hand, the more it invests in AI, the more the problem of underemployment. I mean, not necessarily, but one has to have a very careful approach to evade those kind of things. Okay, I will end it there. We have more or less exhausted, but I want you to end by telling us a little bit about Friends with Socialist China, given it's hard to find real information, good information on China, given the information war. So just end this conversation by telling us a little bit about the platform and what kind of work people can expect on the platform.
So, Friends of Socialist China is a platform. It's more than anything else, it's a website that's based on supporting people's China and promoting understanding of Chinese socialism. Um, and you know, we set it up. It was set up jointly by myself, Keith Bennett, who's my co-editor in Friends of Socialist China, and Danny Haifeng, um, because we always said we support all the socialist states. We support all those countries that are building socialism or that are aspiring towards socialism. Um, but we've foreground China basically for the reasons that we've been talking about for the last hour. But because it's the fact that it's such a massive country, its size and its level of advancement, its level of development mean that it has objectively, the most important and critical role in the global transition to socialism and the global fight against imperialism and for multipolarity. So Friends of Socialist China, on our website, we publish on average probably 10 or 12 articles a week. Some original articles, others republished from various different sources, but always edited by us, always with introductions by us. We run regular events, both in-person events here in London, and increasingly over the course of the last year, we've had a Friends of Socialist China US committee that's been running different events in places like Boston, New York, and Portland. We've got a conference coming up here in London next weekend on the 28th of September, 27th of September, sorry, in Bolivar Hall, which is a very nice function hall that's run by the Venezuelan Embassy here in London. So that's called a Socialist China Conference, which will be marking China's National Day and just discussing various aspects of Chinese socialism. Speakers include Jenny Clegg, Mick Wallace, the former European Member of Parliament, George Galloway, the former British Member of Parliament, and several other speakers. We'll have video contributions from Zhang Weiwei and Li Jingjing. So that should be a very good event. And if people are in London, they should get tickets for that. Yeah, other than that, we run a YouTube channel, we run social media channels, and just try to make our little contribution to promoting people-to-people relations between the West and China, to improving understanding of China, and to improving understanding of the whole process of developing multipolarity, developing sovereignty, and building towards global socialism.
We'll leave it there. Thanks, Carlos. It was wonderful listening to you and having you on.
Thanks, Jyotish. Hope to join you another time.
Of course. Take care. Have a wonderful rest of the day ahead. Bye.
Same to you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.